Sorry.
You got time? Okay, you're fine. Is AV okay? So is there an alternative? Can we test that? Is that working? No, this is working. Okay. I'll go into an intro. It's like the intro process as you walk out. Okay. Yeah, I'll do the initial intro stuff and then things, okay? And then I'll get you in if we can. And then I'll hand this off if necessary. I'll just do some announcements and stuff just so that you can cut this off the front of the piece, okay? Hello. Hi, I'm Big Kate. Just a couple of announcements while we're getting ourselves sorted out. Currently in Monty Hall, Peter Sturge is talking about Core Boot. That's a replacement for the workshop on the session on Scientology versus Anonymous. And there's a change in your timetable. On Friday, we're getting relaunch Bits of Freedom at 4 in the Two Envelopes tent, and Tempest for the casual election leader is in the Monty Hall tent, so that's a swap, I think. Okay? Hopefully, this is going to be a fast-run lecture. Ian is got about 45 slides to do in 60 minutes, so there's going to be time for questions at the end. There'll be a little bit of questions at the end. He's going to there'll be a workshop afterwards on another date, so if you want to come and talk to him about that later and talk in more detail, there'll be a workshop as well. And we're just trying to sort out the technology because it's the technology. And this is a version of the talk Ian spoke at CCC, but it's heavily updated. He is a major political campaigner, made open standards work across the Netherlands. This is part of the political hacking strand, following on from things like WikiLeaks and various other talks in other spaces. And I was supposed to cut this short, so I didn't actually prepare anything more but it looks like we're about to start. And I'll leave it to the man. Could you give him a round of applause?
No.
I'll just use this. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay, everybody can hear me. Very cool. All right. Lost a few minutes, so I hope to get through this. Questions at the end, please. These are my basic house rules. If you have machines that make noise, switch them off, please. And I'll post all the pictures you're about to see on the wiki somewhere, so you can reuse them. And hold your questions till the end. All right. I want to say something about my work in changing Dutch government policy in the area of open source and open standards. And I always want to take a bit of a broader view on what IT is and why it's important in national government and in politics. And so about half a millennia ago, we had an IT information technology revolution, and it was this. It was the Gutenberg printing press. And the Gutenberg printing press allowed for the production of books to be increased with a speed of about a factor of 10,000. So before this machine, a book was something that was handwritten by a monk over a period of 2 years. And therefore the production cost of a single book, even if it was just a copy of an existing book, was the equivalent of €250,000, because nobody could write. So these were very special, highly educated people. Now, with this machine, you could make a couple of hundred books in a single afternoon. So the price of books dropped through the floor, and then the spread of books, therefore, went through the roof. Absolutely. And that ended the Middle Ages. It started the Renaissance. It started, cultural change, science and technology, and basically the modern world that we have today is based on this technology. So that's how fundamental IT is. So the printing press caused chaos in Europe because now you get the information from your priest anymore. You could read yourself in the Bible. And then, of course, people got Bibles in their own language and they started reading them and thinking and discussing. And so then we had about 250 years of religious war while everybody was figuring out, well, what does it really mean? But in the process, lots of other books were printed as well. And so in 1648, we got some peace back and the beginning of the modern Europe of modern states. And you can see that Germany has had a pretty bad time in its religious wars. That's pretty much gone. But you can see there the beginnings of the modern Europe already coming about. So spreading knowledge, we've been doing it for a while. Of course, before 1440, we did it through other means, but that was very slow. The book accelerated it 10,000-fold. But since the late 60s, of course, we've been doing the next revolution where we take computers and we connect them to each other. We now have several billion over the planet. Half of them are mobile phones. And they're all connected together. The price has gone so low that everybody has one or several. Even in a country like Brazil, there are 100 million plus mobile phone users now. So it's going very fast. And I think this revolution will be as fundamental as the last revolution of 500 years ago. Except it won't take 500 years for the revolution to play out. It's going to take maybe 50 or 60 years, and half of them are gone. So we are going to see more change because of this in the next 30 years than we saw over the last 500 in our societies. Again, that's how fundamental it is. Now, computers have been evolving at a geometric rate for over a century. And this is sort of a one-slide picture. You can see it, how much computing power you get for an amount of money. It's still going up, and a crisis or no crisis makes no difference. And it means that computers now do everything. So we go shopping through our computer. We do banking through our computer, which can be a bit tricky, but you can do it. We get our music through our computers. Of course, if you're a hacker, you get your music by this channel. Computers now predict who is going to win a sports competition. They can drive cars autonomously, even in cities. There's lots of things can do. We now have 3D printers run by cheap computers that can not only replicate themselves, but also produce all kinds of great things. There are some demos of that at HAR right here. So computers aren't just typewriters, which is the old view, certainly within government, that people had. A PC is just a typewriter, except it's a bit easier. It's much, much more fundamental than that. It is how we communicate with each other, and certainly in a secure way. It's how we organize each other. If we want to do political protesting or something like that, we want to change something. They run effectively our factory, and our entire industrial economy is dependent on computers and software. And of course, there's still some countries where people actually vote on computers, not in this country, luckily. But there is still one computer involved, even in the Dutch voting system, which is one central system that tabulates all the other analog paper votes at the end of the evening. I'll get back to this later in the talk. And of course, the computers are the new printing presses. So now we all have our own printing press, and we all have blogs and Twitter accounts, and we can all talk to the world, and then the world can talk back to us. So if the computers are the printing presses, and we want freedom of the press, then it's important that not one or two companies own all the presses or own the software that makes the press do something. We need some diversity there. So in other media, for instance, television in Europe, no single company or entity can own more than 30% in a country. So for instance, in the Netherlands, a single commercial entity cannot own more than 30% of all the television channels. And we think it's good to have that diversity so we have many voices and keep our democracy going. Now, of course, in software land, this is not the case at all. Not only do we have enormous concentration of power, but we also get all kinds of funny rules that come with the software. This is an example of a software license from Microsoft FrontPage, which you may remember as a program you use to make really crappy web pages. But basically it says we're going to sell you the software, and then we're going to say what you can and cannot do with it. So it's like buying a pen, and then it has a little sticker on the box that says, you cannot write negative things about the Parker Corporation with this pen. I mean, would you buy such a pen? Would you even, take that seriously? Well, this is what in the license, and I dare anyone to pick a legal fight with Microsoft. You need seriously have deep pockets and have a lot of lawyers. So there are many reasons to want a different way of how we do software and who controls software, who builds it, getting the diversity. These are some of the reasons, and you can pick one you like, depending on where you're coming from and what your sort of political background is. I'll go over some of you. For my participation in this whole thing, started with this. This is a screenshot I made on January 1st, 2002, when I tried to go to the website of the National Railway to plan a train trip, as I do often. And instead of showing me the planner, it showed me this. And it says, you don't have Internet Explorer. This site only works with Internet Explorer. Go here to download Internet Explorer. And there I was sitting on my ThinkPad with Red Hat 5 point something, for which there is no Internet Explorer. So, I mean, the Dutch Railway is, it's still state-owned nominally. So it's more or less a public utility, and it was telling me, unless you buy Microsoft Windows, you can't come in. You're not welcome here. So I was quite pissed about that. So I wrote a very angry email to some people from the National Railway. But then I thought, well, the webmasters, he probably can't help it either. So let me copy in some people. So I copied in people from Parliament, people from the Ministry of Transport, and some journalists, and I stopped at about 50 because then it becomes spam. And I got a mail back from the railway that says, okay, well, we heard your complaint, and we have had a lot of complaints. We're going to do something about it. And 2 weeks later, they had a new site that didn't have any of these problems. But I also got a mail back from a member of Parliament from the Greens Party, and that mail became a conversation and a series of conversation over a series of months. And we said, look, there's a fundamental problem with the way we have IT, certainly at the PC level. And the government needs to step in, basically, to intervene, because the market obviously can't solve it, otherwise it would have done so. So on 19th of November 2002, we had a motion in Parliament, which was unanimously adopted, which is quite rare for a motion from the Greens Party, that says, okay, we have a failure of the way the software market is working in the Netherlands, and the government needs to step in. And one of the ways the government can do that is to use open source and open standards as much as possible itself, since it's one of the biggest software players. So the first guy there on the line, Kees Vendrik, he became a very good friend because, of course, as a member of Parliament for a small political party, he doesn't get to have many of those sort of unanimous motions in Parliament. So now, of course, I had his mobile number, and I could, point him in certain directions and help him out with things. So I kept feeding him and other people information, and the sort of item advanced on the political agenda very, very slowly. And so you need to draw in people from other political parties, and they will have other things they will listen to. So this is sort of my experience on different Dutch political parties. So this is from left to right on the political spectrum, which still tells you something. And it tells you some of the issues that might be good for that party. So lower cost, everybody loves lower cost. Lower cost is always good, if you can prove it, of course, which can be difficult. Social inclusion, transparency, those kinds of things tend to be sort of more leftish issues. And of course, local business, national security tend to be more to the right. But lots of things can work everywhere. I mean, things like, proper functioning of the market, everybody is nominally in favor of that. But when it comes to big business, certain political parties like to support them too. So this is the Netherlands. Your local mileage may vary in other countries, but it works like this basically. So in 2003, some few things happened, but not a lot. But in 2004, we got a bit of movement in the dossier when the government tried to buy 150 million euros worth of software without going through the proper procedure of buying software. If you're a European government and you want to spend public money, there is a process that you need to document. If you want to spend more than, I think, 150,000 euros, for instance, on software, you need to document, why you choose that software and not the other one and things like that. And the government didn't do that, but they were about to spend 150 million on desktop software, so word processors and stuff like that. And they only talked to a single vendor, which is, from a procurement perspective, is kind of dumb. I mean, if you go to a single car manufacturer and you say, well, what do you think, what kind of car I should buy? They, of course, are not going to recommend you, somebody else's car or a bike or, a train subscription. So a civil servant who was also pissed off about this whole thing leaked that information. So the next day, some news site carried it. I was part of sending it to a bunch of people. And of course, over the weekend, we wrote questions to be asked in Parliament. And then the next day, they were asked in Parliament. And then by the end of the next week, the contract was dead. So that was good. So that saved the Dutch taxpayers some money, which was nice. And it sort of, showed that there was still very much a big problem where the state actually didn't have control over its own software, really, because it allowed itself to get into a place where it couldn't actually choose to not buy certain things. So the questions that were asked in Parliament were answered between Christmas and New Year's Day, and almost nobody was there, but of course we did get the document. And for the first time, the Dutch government, not the Parliament, but the government, admitted we have a problem. They admitted they were very much dependent on this proprietary software. They also stated that this dependency actually was a problem, which was, again, a first. And then they stated that the adoption of open standards and open source was the way to get out of that problem. So there were wonderful words like dependence on de facto monopolists and language like that, quite strong language, so it was good. So we all know, if you're an addict, the first step into getting off is admitting you're an addict, right? So this was that first step for the Dutch government, to admitting they're addicted, and then, you can do something. So this was a very useful one-page piece of paper for our, big dossier to basically say, look, everybody says it's a problem, even, the Minister for Justice, everybody is agreed on the problem, and then you can talk about solutions. So meanwhile, we were also doing local stuff. The province of Groningen, which is one of the 13 areas of the Netherlands, had a new policy, IT policy document that they were about to finalize politically. And it says, well, open source, well, we're not going to do open source because there's no support for open source. This was in 2004. So I read that and I thought, well, maybe you've heard of, I don't know, a company called IBM. I think they do something with computers, and there's a few other companies out there that can actually do it. So me and a few other people went up there and talked to the provincial council for 4 minutes each. That's the amount of time you can get if you ask nicely in advance. So the difference between the top sentence in their document and the lower text, which was in the revised document after we spent some time talking to it, is 4 people, take an afternoon off to go out there and, talk some sense into these guys. Now, to speak for 4 minutes requires about a day of preparation because you want to get it exactly right. But it is worthwhile to do that. And any citizen can do it. You can just say, look, I need to speak on this. You mail the person in advance, and you go up there and you make sure you have your little speech prepared, and you get 4 minutes of time to talk some sense into them. And it works. Now, then we got new elections and a new government and a very young minister for trade. And he was interested in the area, and he invited us to talk to him. And so we wanted to, help him shine, basically, politically, because that's how you make friends with politicians. He needs to shine in the media. That gives him power. Then he can help you. So you need to help him help you. So that's what we did by feeding him information. So we get a meeting with him, and you spend a lot of time preparing. And you make sure you have all kinds of extra information that you probably won't have time to tell, but then you can, hand it over to his staff people or something. And you make sure you get the first, the core thing, you get into the first 10 minutes of the meeting. Because if the Saudi ambassador calls the Dutch Minister for Trade to talk about oil, you are out. Because you're just not as important as the Saudi ambassador. That's just the way it works. But these are very smart people, at least this guy is, and so you can give them a lot of information in a very short time. But preparation is the key. And then, of course, you spend a lot more time with the staff, explaining more details, giving them documents, pointing them to online resources, and so forth and so forth. And, of course, lots of pretty pictures. So this was one of the pretty pictures that we made to explain the point. 5.2 billion euros is the amount of money the Dutch society spent on importing foreign proprietary software. In other words, that's 100,000 IT jobs that we don't have in the Netherlands because we buy our software outside of the Netherlands instead of, implementing and using open source, which, of course, for many things we can do. Now, this amount is growing by 10% per year, independent of what the rest of the economy does. That means it's totally unsustainable. That we need to, change that curve, otherwise we'll be in deep trouble. So the two things, open standards, open source. Open standards is having a common language. And if you want to do anything big, IT, e-government projects, you need to have common language to share data and to share metadata and things like that. And of course, once upon a long ago, there was a big building project, and they didn't have a common language, and therefore it failed. So, we're not saying anything new here. It's all fairly obvious. So open standards is just a no-brainer to do. This is an example of an open standard. It's a standard 20-ton shipping container. And the great thing about the standard 20-ton shipping container is that you can use it for all kinds of applications, like transporting wood or a data center, and you can use all kinds of modes of transportation. But the great thing is that the people filling the container and determining its function don't have to know how it's going to be transported. So the guy driving the truck doesn't care whether the container, holds just bags of grain or a data center or something else. For him, it's all the same. So what this means is a massive flexibility as opposed to the systems we had before this. Now, that's also how the internet works. I mean, how is it possible that the government says, well, we can't have our computers talk to each other, while on the other hand, we live in a world where 3 billion computers are talking to each other every day, and they're made by thousands of different vendors? Well, the answer is open standards. So we have lots of internet-based services like web browsing or voice over IP or email, and we have lots of computers, all different, and they can all talk to each other and share services because they share a set of common open standards. And these, of course, are some of the very, very basic internet standards that make the internet possible. So this is basically how I explain it to sort of non-technical people. Services, this is, of course, what the politicians are interested in, e-government, things like that. And devices and software, that's what the IT people tend to be interested in. It's the shiny things you buy. But the middle layer, that's where the action is. If you do that right, if you architect it correctly, then you can make really large, flexible, and interoperable systems like the internet. And if you do it wrong, like many of the big e-government projects, then it's not going to work, no matter how many billions of euros you spent on it. So this is the reality today for many organizations, both inside the government and out, where the hardware market, so PCs, laptops, servers, things like that, is a fairly well-functioning market. So you can buy a range of products for a range of prices, and there's good competition, and there are alternatives to choose from. But when you get to the platform, the operating system, and some of the layers on top of that, you get vertical integration, which makes everything work together really well, except you always have to buy from a single vendor. So we have a big problem there where everything from the interface to the operating system is all tied together. And that means that there's very little choice, which means that you can have an IT policy, an IT strategy. But since half your technology stack has already been determined for you because you made it some choice for some application 5 years ago, then, what's your choice? And are you then capable to actually control the organization, whether it's a business or a government institution? Now, of course, software companies that are threatened by open source in their business model have been fighting very hard to make sure that we, the customer, can't leave. So, of course, the latest generations, the operating system is actually tied to the hardware with encryption. And, through all kinds of laws, you can't actually change that or alter it. So now you're totally not in charge. Now, if a company wants to do this, if they're happy with that, then, you're welcome to it. But, of course, for a government, this is simply not acceptable. So what we think, and one of the things I do in my sort of day job is to help companies and other organizations achieve these kinds of IT architectures, is there are basically two kinds of software. It's the generic stuff that everybody has, like a word processor or a web server, the stuff that is independent on what it is that you do. Most of that is available open source today, or will be very soon. Then there's the other stuff, the applications that make your organization special compared to all the other ones. That is the stuff you want to control yourself, because that is what separates you from everybody else. If you want to be an innovative organization, whether commercial or not, you don't control that kind of things, then how can you be different from the next organization? So in the discussion, we found that it is very useful to separate open source and open standards, although they are related, because, of course, often in markets where there is no open source, open standards are going to get sort of broken by companies who have an interest in that. But as talking points, you can split them. And open standards is now a very broadly accepted thing. Open source is still more difficult. Of course, you can talk about open source. This is the generally most known term, certainly about non-technical people. Of course, the principles of free software, that it's not about the technical issue of access to the source. It's about the principles of the freedom to do with it what you want. So whenever I get the opportunity, I try to explain the difference and how they come together. So since September of 2007, we've had a national Dutch IT policy around open standards and open source. And it's a little booklet. You can download it from the Ministry of Economic Affairs, both in English and in Dutch. And these are the main goals. We want our interoperability. We want computer systems to be able to share data. We do not want to be dependent on software vendors as a government. And we need to improve the functioning of the local IT market so that if the government spends public money on IT, we would like them to spend it on Dutch IT companies. This is, a logical thing because we're talking about serious amounts of money. Now, these are some of the concrete things. Open document format is now mandatory for all government organizations. So if you live in the Netherlands and you want to send a letter of complaint to your local government, you can do it in open document format, and they are obliged to be able to read it and respond to it. So if you protest the local tax through a document in ODF and they don't respond within 30 days, then your protest is valid. So, please do, because that, at the very minimum, it gets you some money. I mean, I can't make it easier than that. Now, there are several pilots going on, and there is a budget for education and promotion about the concepts towards government. Now, this is a small project, so they have a few million euros per year to spend on basically educating the rest of the government and the public sector. And just to explain how small their budget is, the government's budget for software per day is about as big as what this organization gets per year. So we spend several million euros per day on buying new proprietary software, and we spend that amount of money per year on educating people to not buy that software. So we still need to do something. The Dutch Antitrust Authority has been asked several times, in fact, to investigate the functioning of the market. They have stated on several occasions that they don't see a problem with the functioning of the market. And that is extra interesting since they also stated that they don't see themselves technically capable of switching to another desktop operating system. So those two things are a bit weird, but they themselves apparently don't see this weirdness. Now, a lot of nonsense has also been told by people about what the plan is and what it isn't. So 3 points that it's definitely not. It does not make open source mandatory, although personally I would like it for some areas. I'll get to that later. But it does not right now. It doesn't forbid specific products. So if a local government wants to continue to buy Microsoft Office to do word processing, then fine. It's just when you save the document, it needs to be in open document format, which you can do, by the way, with Microsoft Office now, so it's no problem. If you can explain to the local taxpayers that you need to spend 500 euros a seat on a word processor when there is a free alternative, hey, it's your local government, it's your money, go ahead. And no specific standards are forbidden. So you need to store your documents in open document format, but if you're a local government and you want to also store them on Betamax tape, hey, go ahead, it's fine, it's your life. Now, even organizations like NATO are now adopting ODF, so it's really, really mainstream. It's basically everybody's doing it. This is not, the most progressive organization on the planet, also not when it comes to IT. And even they are now adopting ODF as an official document standard. So we've really sort of arrived. Now, of course, there are lots of fake grassroots organizations who are fighting this. They say, no, it's very important for governments to have choice. And what they mean, they need to have the choice to buy our software. So organizations like these will spread incredible amounts of disinformation, basically, about what the policy is, what its aims are, and why it's bad, and things like that. And of course, one of the things they've been saying for years, there are lots of legal risks about open source, because you don't know who programmed it, and the project might get sued over patents, and so don't do open source because there are all kinds of untold legal risks, which is really funny right now, because Microsoft has just been sued in a Texas court through a patent company, and apparently they can't sell Word anymore. Now, I think they'll just buy a bunch of judges and this will all go away, but it does goes to show that legal risks are not, just for open source. It's basically all software has legal risk, particularly if the legal system has gone totally insane, which apparently it has in the US. But in Europe, open source is on the march. Pretty much all countries are doing it in some form or another. Germany and France are ahead in practical implementation. Spain is doing really cool stuff. The Netherlands was the first country to have a formal policy, but in terms of practical implementations, we are still lagging. We're hoping to correct that. Now, I wanted to get back to the national sovereignty bit for a bit. Because now that we have a practical policy, and so I consider sort of the first phase of my personal goal, to be accomplished, and now we need to implement it, and this is, lots of work and lots of meetings, and the good thing about it is that you can actually get hired to do it by the government and get paid to do it, but it's not, of course, as sexy as the initial sort of battle. So I'd like to take it to the next level, and I want to try out some ideas. I want to take you back to these guys. In the 16th century, the Netherlands declared itself independent, and then we fought the Spanish for 80 years. And at some point we won, or probably they just left because of the bad weather, but it's one of those. But anyway, then, so in 1648 we became our own nation, and have been ever since. And, all of Europe became nation states. So these are areas of land where a bunch of people got together. We said, okay, we share a language and a culture. We're going to elect a government that is going to, run our society for us. And if we don't like them, we elect another one. And then we're going to make some rules how we live together. So this is what is known as the nation state. It's an interesting concept. And it is ruled through laws. But nowadays, of course, those laws become reality in software. If you have a state pension, the transfer of money from the state to your bank account is done in software. If the state does things like tapping phones for reasons of national security, it does so through software and many other things. Without software, modern society would simply collapse, and very rapidly. So then the question becomes, well, who controls that software? Because if the software is so vital for the day-to-day functioning of society, and government doesn't have a sort of ultimate control over it, then do we still have a government, or is it really sort of a corporate republic instead of a democratic country? So I would pose that governments should have control over all critical IT functions. Not, to exert power, but because they represent us. Because they need to control it so that companies or foreign governments don't control it. And having access, of course, to the source code of that is vital. Because if you don't have the source code, so you can't compile the source code into a working program and check that that is actually the same as the stuff you're running, then how do you know what the computer does? It's very, very hard to actually check it without having access to the source code. So if a country wants to actually be a sovereign country and be in charge of its own affairs, then you need to have control over the software. Now, these are some areas that I think are important. If you do voting computers, poor sod, then you need to have access to the source code for that. Of course, everything that your national government does, communications, file storage, stuff like that, parliament things, you need to have control over. Your energy infrastructure, because without that your nation falls apart. Your defense systems. If you buy a Joint Strike Fighter at, I think, $80 million a pop, but the software has a kill switch, and the kill switch is in the Pentagon and not in your defense ministry, then basically what you're doing is you're outsourcing your Air Force to the US. And you no longer have your own Air Force. What you have is a sort of an Air Force on loan until somebody flips a switch and the airplane dies. Now, the UK Air Force actually made a big stink out of this. They said, if you don't give us the source code, we'll not buy the plane. Regrettably, our government hasn't made that point yet. I hope they will. Of course, in the middle, that's a logo of our internal security group. Ooh, there we go. And basically the equivalent to the American FBI or the British MI5. Now, of course, the police infrastructure, the justice system needs to be in control of its data. The Dutch justice system just had a 2-day computer outage because of a MSN virus from 2007. It was really cool. What that means is I am not going to talk to the police if I witness a crime, because my name will be written down in some document which is then open to be hijacked by a virus, and thus my name can become known to the people I'm testifying against. So I'm just not going to talk to the police until they get their shit in order. So I hope they will. So other things like air traffic control, the national media, these are all things that we need to control ourselves if we take ourselves seriously as an autonomous country. Now the French gendarme, which is sort of the French national police, 90,000 people, are doing this. They're doing it for various reasons. National security is one of the reasons that they mention. The other is the fact that it saves them about 50 million euros, which is also nice. So they're switching all of their computer system to Ubuntu Linux from Windows and various other things they had. And they are now in the process of doing that. It's one of the biggest implementations right now in government. Now, I talked to you about the Spanish Civil War earlier. Last year I found this little document. And it turns out that the US Declaration of Independence, which is of course one of the big all-time good political documents, was actually inspired by the Dutch Declaration of Independence, which predates it by about 200 years. Or so these people say, and of course being a Dutch person, I'm quite proud of that. So I did a little mashup of the American Declaration of Independence. I'd like to read to you that now, and I think this should be sort of our manifesto. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all users are created equal, and that they are endowed by hackers with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of content. And that to secure these rights, software is distributed among the users, deriving its powers from their consent, because it's your computer. And that whenever any forms of software becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the users to alter or abolish it, and to institute new software, laying at its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such a way that it shall seem to them most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So it's a very cool thing that a 220-year-old document still really works if you just do a search and replace on one of two words. It's very, very timeless. So join the revolution. It's very cool. You meet great people. You have a lot of fun, and sometimes you even get to talk to important people, which can be also a lot of fun. And somebody needs to do it, because there are massive interests in not having this change. I know for a fact that whenever European governments or other governments, for instance in Latin America, make these kinds of moves, they get phone calls from Washington, D.C. And basically those phone calls say, don't do this or else. And the fact that those kinds of phone calls are made tells you that it's really important. And so therefore we need to do it. And if that means taking a free Saturday, then it means taking a free Saturday. So control and civil liberties is like anything else. Use it or lose it. You'll hear that a lot over the next few days and various other things. Use it or lose it is important. And this is also why these events are so important, because we get together here with a bunch of people and we talk this through and we give each other new ideas. And hopefully some more people will join up, basically. Now, one of the things I hear a lot of people, they say, well, but it's so complex. This is such a big issue that, it's hopeless. Also, this is what governments use as excuse to not do anything. They say, oh, it's so big, we're not going to do it. And this is a great example of how you sort of approach that mentally. It was, Napoleon was riding along with the generals in the south of France along the road. It was a hot sunny day, and they're all wearing these woolen uniforms, and everybody was sweating. And Napoleon had a bright idea. He said, what we need to do is we need to plant trees along all the roads in France, and then our soldiers can march in the shade to the battlefields. And then they will be a lot, fitter and better rested when they arrive at the battlefield, so they'll be more effective. And of course, all the generals, really wanted to do war stuff and no gardening stuff. So they all started to protest, and they all started to think up reasons why that could not work. And then one of the most senior generals said, well, Mr. Bonaparte, you do realize that if we plant those trees, that it will take 20 years for them to grow tall enough to provide the shade that you're talking about. And Napoleon said, well, of course I understand that. That's why I want you to start planting tonight. And they did. And right now in France, if you go along certain of the old roads back from the 19th century, you can still see those trees. They're still there. So if you want to report for duty to work on this, then there's a chance for that this Saturday in the afternoon in the bike shed, where one of the other people who works on this in the Netherlands very actively, Jelle de Jong, he is doing a workshop. I'll be there too, and we'll be seeing if we can, take this more practical. And of course, him and me, we are about the Dutch government because that's, our government to a certain extent at least. But many of those lessons can be applied elsewhere. So if you want to talk about this and see what you can do in a very sort of down-to-earth manner, then please join us on Saturday. We can have some fun and think up some cool ways to do. There is one other thing. Just across here, in the sun, directly out the door, there is Michiel Leenaerts from the NLnet Foundation, which is a non-profit foundation that financially supports open source projects and IT projects that have to do with things like digital civil liberties. And he has found a way to get money into his foundation, which he will then use to fund open source projects. And if you are here and you have a company, and it doesn't have to be an IT company, you can have a little butcher shop or you can be a tennis teacher, but if you have a company, you can sign his form, then the economics ministry will give him 2,500 euros. And all those little pieces of 2,500 euros put together will finance a bunch of really cool open source projects. For instance, things like Small Sister, which will provide us with secure email. So if you have a company, or if you know anybody on the terrain who has a company, send them over there to that table, sign the form. You don't have to do anything, but the economics ministry will give NLnet money, and then we'll use that to do good things. Of course, if you have an open source project you would like to have funded by NLnet, you can also go and talk to him, and if it's a good idea, he'll give you money to work on the thing you love most. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and if there is time, I'll take some questions. I see we still have 15 minutes, so I'll take some questions, and I thank you for your attention. I think Kate is going to do a roving mic. If there are questions, raise your hand so Kate can hand you a mic.
Hello. My question is, how would it be to help political parties to run open source in their offices? Because obviously some of them don't, and they're even propagating using open source.
Yeah. Many political parties in the Netherlands, they tend to be very small IT shops themselves and very underfunded. So if you volunteer to help with their IT, usually they will welcome you with open arms because they're always short of manpower, especially sort of, actually professional IT people. So it's fairly easy to just basically volunteer to help them. And then, if you have a little bit of expertise very soon, you can help them think out, how the next sort of evolution of their IT will be. So it's basically a matter of volunteering and helping out. But it also means that you have to get down to the nitty-gritty stuff of, switching over an office environment from, whatever they have to maybe an open environment, which is quite a tricky job. It's not necessarily easy if they have financial applications and software to run, their membership registry, which may be 12-year-old and running only on a certain version of Windows. And so it's not an easy process, but it's very worthwhile to start it. And in the process of doing it, you actually create awareness with a lot of people that this is more than just a technical issue, it's a political issue. So you help to politicize more people on it.
I asked some parties, well, do you run open source, which you propagate? And they say, well, we should think about it. So there is willingness, but... the way to do it is to actually go there and help one specific group. It can also be like a local political group in a city, which tend to be smaller and sort of less complex in terms of organization. But you have to actually go there and do it for them, not just a theory, so hands-on. Maybe get some money from NLnet to do it professional.
Yeah, well, they could maybe support people who would be willing to do that, absolutely, yeah. Any other questions?
Hello.
Hi.
I don't know if it's a problem here in the Netherlands, but have you fought against data retention laws and criminalization of hacking tools and stuff like that? Because there was a treaty in Bulgaria in 2001 that implements. It's from where it's derived all the things like the Ripper Act in England.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Please speak a little bit slower and maybe point the microphone away from the speaker.
In Bulgaria in 2001, there was a treaty that was about cybercrime and everything.
Yeah.
And from there, for the whole Europe, you have like data retention and criminalization of the hacking tools and so on. I don't know if it's a problem here in the Netherlands, if you are aware of it.
In the Netherlands, hacking tools are still legal. They're also used by the Dutch government a lot for all kinds of purposes. I know in Germany they have been made illegal, but I don't think that a lot of companies actually use them, sort of stick to that rule.
Yes, because now, okay, no one is still enforcing the laws, but if they are made, like they were made in Germany, in England, now they're going to be made in Portugal and in other countries, because it's an EU regulation. Eventually, it will spread across the whole Europe.
It might if we don't do something about it. Then yeah, so that will be made a political issue. You know, can you make software illegal, or can you make knowledge about software illegal? Because of course, software can always be recreated if you know that something can be done. I think making certain types of software illegal is probably something like making certain drugs illegal. It's been done in many countries, and it is without exception failed, both in the real world and in actually achieving any goal. So then probably the things will go away after a while. But we have to protest it every step of the way, because otherwise it's going to go further.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hello. I was quite concerned to hear that Microsoft was preventing people from using their software in a specific way. But I noticed that the user license was 2004, yeah? I don't know if you're... I know I can just find out by reading all the Microsoft user licenses and stuff, but hopefully you're aware of whether or not they are still doing that, or whether or not they've been embarrassed out of it. Would you know?
I know for a fact that within government, up until recently, they didn't. The governments didn't really study the license. So what we do is we would study them and then point out things to them. Yeah. So, for instance, in the original Windows Vista license, when it just came out, it says very clearly that if you are a professional user, you cannot comment negatively about the product in a public forum.
Yeah.
So what that meant basically that if you're a civil servant and you're using Windows Vista and you think it's crap, which might happen,
not to say so.
then you can't actually say that in a public forum. Now, then there was a lot of protest about that part of the license across the world, and so Microsoft changed it. But if you can convince legal professionals to actually read those documents, they will either cry or laugh very hard, but they will certainly do something. Because some of the stuff is in there that it's just draconian, it's bizarre. Yeah. Often it's also just not legal.
Yeah.
So they say, for instance, we reserve the right to change these conditions retroactively. That sort of thing is actually in the contract. So they say, we reserve the right to change this contract from our side without telling you, going back in time until the time that you purchased it. Okay. Now, if you make legal professionals within organizations aware of those kinds of conditions, then they will look at the software with a very different sort of eye.
Sure.
So, but you have to convince them to actually read it.
Yeah. Thanks.
Anybody else? Thank you.
Thanks. It's just a quick question, picking up on the last, but one question about criminalisation of certain activities. Could you say a little brief word about the case of Gary McKinnon and similar provisions in the Netherlands?
All right. Well, it's a bit of a tangent, but there is a British hacker who in 2001 and 2002 actually accessed a whole bunch of US defense and NASA systems. He claims he was looking for information about UFOs or something like that. And he is about to be extradited to the US to serve 70 years in some sort of black hole type prison. It probably won't be Guantanamo Bay because supposedly they're closing that, but it will be something else. It is funny that in the UK, the local authorities didn't consider what he did important enough to even take the trial. So in the UK, he would have gotten off with a fine or maybe, 100 hours of community service. But then the US came in and says, look, this guy is very dangerous and evil. And he said, look, I just pointed out that most of your Pentagon computers didn't have a password on it. And so he might be extradited to the US, where they will do God knows what to him. It's a bit tricky these days to know what goes on there in the cellars. And yeah, that is a bit of a scary thought, because you can do things that are nominally legal or not that illegal here in Europe, thinking you will be defended by your government, which you elected to defend you against this sort of crap, and then it turns out that somebody from across the Atlantic can just pick up a phone and order you to be delivered into their hands, and then what happens? I mean, this is, for me, precisely the kind of crap. I hire my government to defend me against that sort of stuff. And if they don't, then there's a real problem. So yeah, that is an interesting case. I'm certainly following it. If you Google for Gary McKinnon, then you'll find all kinds of information on him. It's quite scary, because I know that there are quite a few people here probably have done things a lot more serious than what he did, and I don't think most of them deserve to be locked up for the next 70 years. So that's quite tricky. So be careful out there and have a good lawyer.
Any other questions? Maybe one more. Any more else?
Okay, if there's nothing else, then please go see Michiel if you're Dutch and you have a company. And if you want to continue this and do it more sort of hands-on, then I'll have to see you on Saturday. Thank you all very much.